Learn which horror movie inspired a scene in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Discover why Snow White was nowhere to be seen in the original Disneyland and Disney World attractions. Find out how Disney removed all references to cannibalism from the original storyline. Learn about the canceled prequel. All this and much more in Snow White's ride through Disney history. Walt Disney was a visionary right from the start. In the 1920s, Walt made the bold move of combining live action with animation in the Alice comedies. In 1928, Disney kept pushing the envelope by creating a sound cartoon with Steamboat Willie starring Mickey and Minnie Mouse, always wanting to raise the bar. In 1937, Walt created the first full-length, traditionally animated feature film with Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Few thought that moviegoers would have the patience to watch a movie-length cartoon, so Snow White's becoming the highest-grossing film of American cinematic history, a distinction that Snow White kept until 1940's Gone with the Wind, was a huge vindication for Walt's creative vision. The choice of Snow White as Disney's first film was inspired by Walt having seen the 1916 silent film version of Snow White as a Kansas City teenager. The original Brothers Grimm version was too dark to be suitable for children, so Disney cut the beginning of the book where we learn that Snow White's real mother pricks her finger on a needle, wishes for a beautiful daughter, and then dies in childbirth. In the book, The Huntsman was directed by the Queen to kill Snow White and bring back her heart, which she planned to eat to become immortal. While Disney did keep the part about the Queen asking for Snow White to be murdered and her heart brought back to her as evidence, Disney left out the references to cannibalism. The Queen attempted to murder Snow White 3 times in the book. Disney reduced it down to 1 time when she fed Snow White a poison apple. Creative works are influenced by the creative works that came before them. In the case of Snow White, Walt included a scene in which the evil queen transforms herself into a witch. This scene was inspired by 1931's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. As you can see, the Disney film had some scary moments. So scary that England deemed the film too scary for children. So in that country, moviegoers under the age of 16 had to be accompanied by a parent. With the huge success of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, you may be wondering why there has never been a sequel. Prior to Snow White, The Three Little Pigs was a huge hit for Disney in 1933, which led to Disney trying out 3 sequels, but none of them reached the success of the original. These Three Little Pigs sequels seem to have soured Walt on making further sequels. An older Walt Disney reflected on his career by saying, "By nature, I'm an experimenter. To this day, I don't believe in sequels. I can't follow popular cycles. I have to move on to new things." So a full-blown Snow White sequel was not on the table. So instead, the Seven Dwarfs made appearances in some early 1940s shorts, including the 1939 short, The Standard Parade. In 1938, despite Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs being a major achievement in filmmaking, a Hollywood unaccustomed to animated feature-length films only nominated Snow White for 1 award, for music scoring. Snow White lost to the film 100 Men and a Girl. A year later, in 1939, it seems that the Academy realized that they had snubbed Walt Disney's great achievement. So in that year, Walt Disney received a special Academy Award consisting of 1 full-size Oscar and 7 dwarf Oscars, presented to Walt Disney by Shirley Temple. Long before Disney Plus, DVDs, or even VHS tapes, new generations of children enjoyed classic Disney films in movie theaters through theatrical re-releases. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was the very first Disney film to be re-released back into theaters, setting in place a new practice of Disney re-releasing its classic animated feature-length films. Although the films were unchanged, each re-release offered a new generation of young children who had yet to see the film. Snow White was re-released theatrically in 1944, 1952, 1958, 1967, 1975, 1983, 1987, and 1993. The next chapter of Snow White's ride through Disney history brings us to Anaheim, California. Disneyland opened to the world on July 17, 1955, with Snow White's Adventures as an opening day attraction. Some of the artists who created Disney's classic films were the very same artists who brought these films to life at Disneyland in 3-dimensional attractions. Ken Anderson, the art director on the 1937 film, returned to the story of Snow White, this time interpreting his own film into a theme park ride. Compared to today, the facade was much plainer and the props were much more two-dimensional. The original attraction used to have a large sign out in front featuring the witch, warning guests that the attraction was scary. The attraction was a dark ride that told the tale of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, but the attraction left people wondering, where was Snow White? Well, what many people didn't understand was that the attraction was told from the main character's point of view, so it made sense that you never saw Snow White because you were Snow White. At first, the attraction vehicles had only one row. Later, the attraction vehicles were replaced with ones with 2 rows, increasing the ride's capacity. In addition to Snow White having her own attraction, she and the Seven Dwarfs also appeared elsewhere in Disneyland. On June 16, 1956, opening day attraction Canal Boats of the World reopened as Storybook Land Canal Boats, replacing what was supposed to have been miniature landmarks of the world with miniature scenes from Disney animated films. Among the original Storybook Land scenes was a miniature diamond mine from Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and if you get lucky, you might even climb aboard a boat named Snow White. In 1961, marble statues from Italy of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs were gifted to Walt Disney. Disney artist and Imagineer John Hench was assigned the task of placing them in the park. A grotto and wishing well were added next to Sleeping Beauty's castle, but there was a problem. Snow White was the same size as the dwarfs. Hench placed Snow White above the dwarfs, so that with the magic of forced perspective, the size differences were barely noticeable. Snow White grottos can also be found in Tokyo Disneyland and Hong Kong Disneyland. In 1971, Walt Disney World's Magic Kingdom opened with an East Coast version of Disneyland's Snow White's Adventures. The Disneyland version was already scary, and the Disney World version doubled down on the scariness. In fact, the Disney World version ended with the witch using a stick to push a boulder on top of you, and in the very next scene, it was clear that the witch got you. Guests got off the ride vehicles wondering if the witch was the one that lived happily ever after. Snow White's Adventures was not the only opening day Disney World attraction featuring Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Riding on the success of the first audio animatronic show, Enchanted Tiki Room, Florida's Magic Kingdom not only opened their own Tiki Room, but also pioneered 2 new audio animatronic shows, the Country Bear Jamboree and the Mickey Mouse Revue. The Mickey Mouse Revue was an audio animatronics show led by conductor Mickey Mouse and included several Disney characters, including all the dwarfs and Snow White. Snow White songs played prominently in the show, with Hi-Ho, Whistle While You Work, I'm Wishing, and the Silly Song. The Mickey Mouse Revue played until 1980, when it was relocated to Tokyo Disneyland, where it ran from 1983 to 2009. Snow White not only appeared in movie theaters and Disney theme parks, she also appeared in elementary school classrooms. I was a primary school student in the 1970s and vividly remember my teacher playing Disney educational films in the classroom, mostly centered around Jiminy Cricket. However, in 1978, a Disney educational film was released in schools featuring Snow White. It was called Snow White, A Lesson in Cooperation, which taught that cooperating, even while doing chores, can be a rewarding experience. In 1979, Snow White took to the New York stage when the story of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was performed at Radio City Music Hall. A performance was taped and released on pay TV in 1980 and then on video. This performance was also televised in 1987 on the Disney Channel as Snow White Live. In 1983, Tokyo Disneyland opened its gates with opening day attraction Snow White's Adventures. This version mostly resembled the Florida version, but also with some elements of the California version. Of course, this version was conducted in Japanese. After a lengthy closure, Disneyland's Fantasyland went through a complete transformation in 1983 to become the new Fantasyland. The Fantasyland dark rides were gutted and completely remade from the ground up. Both the interiors and exteriors of the attractions were reimagineered, offering high-quality ride-throughs and beautifully themed, detailed exteriors. Snow White's Adventures became Snow White's Scary Adventures, in an effort to be more transparent to parents of young children about the ride's content. The old Snow White attraction had a recurring challenge. Guests began to steal the poison apple out of the hand of the Wicked Witch so often that the word got out that a stolen poison apple was the cherished collector's item from the park. For some, it became a game in which Imagineers got the last laugh. In the new 1983 version of Snow White's Scary Adventures, Imagineers replaced the physical poison apple with a projection created by a parabolic mirror so that when guests reached out to steal the apple, there was nothing physical to steal. The apple was just reflected light. Similar to the Walt Disney World version, the final scene left guests believing that the witch was the one that lived happily ever after. Shortly thereafter, a lightning effect was added so that guests saw a flash, which made it a little clearer that a bolt of lightning struck and the witch fell off the cliff. Although guests riding in the vehicles still experience the story from the character Snow White's perspective, after over 2 decades of guests asking, "Where is Snow White?" for the very first time, guests got to see Snow White in her own attraction, in the cottage scene with the dwarfs. As a cast member in Fantasyland in the 1980s and 90s, I worked on several of the dark rides. Back in those days, only one cast member worked on a dark ride at a time by themselves. The operator was responsible for monitoring guests exiting the vehicles, loading guests onto vehicles, and advancing the vehicles throughout the station. In current times, multiple cast members operate the attraction as a team. Gone are the days of working the attraction by yourself. In 1983, moviegoers could watch Snow White in the theater during one of its re-releases. A year later, in 1984, the film Gremlins was released and featured a scene where gremlins were in a theater watching a movie. What movie, might you ask? Well, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, of course. After a 2-year hiatus, in 1985, the Main Street Electrical Parade returned to Disneyland with the introduction of a brand new Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs unit. In 1987, Snow White celebrated its 50th anniversary. Disneyland celebrated Snow White's golden anniversary throughout the year. The Videopolis stage gave guests a hot spot where they could dance under the stars to hit songs of the 1980s by night. And Singin' Dancin' Hi-Ho, a stage show with singers and dancers and Snow White characters, by day. Singing Dancing Hi-Ho presented the story of Snow White as it had never been seen before, mixing the 1930s music and characters with a distinctly 1980s style. Disneyland also celebrated that year with a parade, Snow White's Golden Anniversary Celebration. Snow White's Golden Anniversary was not only celebrated at Disneyland, but also on television. On May 22nd, 1987, NBC aired the TV special Disney's Golden Anniversary of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, which looked back at the film with Dick Van Dyke, Jane Curtin, Sherman Hemsley, and Linda Ronstadt. In 1989, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was selected for preservation in the National Film Registry by the Library of Congress for being culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. On April 12, 1992, Euro Disneyland, now known as Disneyland Paris, opened its gates with opening day attraction Blanche-Neige et les Sept Nains, similar to the Disneyland version, but the French version made it more obvious that Snow White, not the witch, was the one who had a happy ending. Starting in 1992 in Disneyland and in 1998 in Disney MGM Studios theme park, now known as Disney's Hollywood Studios, the nighttime spectacular Fantasmic featured a princess medley in which Snow White dances to the song Someday My Prince Will Come. In 1993, the reissue of the film Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was the first ever to be completely restored by being digitized by computer, cleaned up, and then printed back to film. In 1994, Walt Disney World updated its Snow White ride-through attraction. Ironically, the name was changed from Snow White's Adventures to Snow White's Scary Adventures, even though the update was markedly less scary than its frightening predecessor. And as a result, guests could see the character Snow White in her own attraction for the very first time. On October 28, 1994, the film was released for the first time on home video, on VHS and Laserdisc, as the first release in the Walt Disney Masterpiece Collection. In the 2000s, Disney Toon Studios began development on a computer-animated prequel to Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, titled The Seven Dwarfs, a story explaining how the dwarfs met and how the evil queen killed Snow White's father and took the throne was pitched. According to the director, Disney Toon management changed the prequel's plot to center around how Dobby lost his voice upon witnessing the death of his mother. After Disney purchased Pixar in 2006, John Lassiter, Disney Toon's new chief creative officer, canceled Seven Dwarfs. Dwarfs. In 2001, Snow White, the Fairest of Them All was a 2-hour film from Hallmark Entertainment that first televised in Israel in October 2001, played on the Wonderful World of Disney on March 17, 2002. In this version of Snow White, the dwarfs were named after the days of the week. In 1995, the Videopolis stage at Disneyland, the former home to Singin' Dancin' Hi-Ho, was renamed the Fantasyland Theater. The story of Snow White returned in a new Disneyland stage production called Snow White: An Enchanting Musical. This was a more traditional retelling of the film, with Star Trek legend Patrick Stewart providing the voice for the Magic Mirror. In 2012, the Carthay Circle restaurant opened at Disney's California Adventure as part of a new land called Buena Vista Street. The restaurant pays homage to the original Carthay Circle Theater, where in 1937 the film Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs made its premiere. When Disneyland updated its Fantasyland in 1983, much of the land was rebuilt from the ground up with a new design. Unlike Disneyland, rather than updating Disney World's Fantasyland, the choice was made to mostly keep the old Fantasyland, but then to expand the land with new offerings. One exception in the update was on May 31st, 2012, Snow White's Scary Adventures was closed permanently and replaced with Princess Fairy Tale Hall, a permanent character meet and greet location. However, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs returned to Fantasyland in 2014 with the attraction Seven Dwarfs Mine Train, whose ride system has a tilting vehicle simulating the swaying and tipping you would feel in a mine cart. This mild roller coaster sits in the very location where 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea submarine voyage once stood. In 2016, Shanghai Disneyland opened 2 attractions based on Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. The park has its own Seven Dwarfs Mine Train, and it also has an interactive walkthrough attraction unique to Shanghai Disneyland called Once Upon a Time Adventure. In 2020, coronavirus spread throughout the world, creating a global pandemic, which necessitated that Disneyland close its gates on March 14, 2020. The parks remained closed for 412 days until April 30th, 2021. During the pandemic closure, Snow White's Scary Adventures was transformed into Snow White's Enchanted Wish, with a more cohesive storyline and improved special effects. Well, this has been Snow White's ride through Disney history so far, but with Snow White being such a classic, there is more Snow White to come. Keeping with the tradition of live-action remakes of classic Disney animated films, a live-action adaptation of the animated Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs is being made, and the role of Snow White herself is set to be played by Rachel Zegler. On January 1st, 2024, the original version of Mickey Mouse entered the public domain, 95 years after Steamboat Willie. The original Brothers Grimm version of Snow White is already in the public domain, and the 1937 Disney version of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs is scheduled to enter the public domain on January 1st, 2033. Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the best YouTuber of them all? Well, if you answered me, the Palm Springs linguist, then please click the subscribe button and the notification bell. What is your favorite moment in Snow White's history? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, you will love these great videos about Disney history.